So last time we met, we talked about endogenous growth models. There's really an entire class of endogenous growth models, and I just presented one fairly simple endogenous growth model for you guys to see. And it gave us an idea as to how there could be a source for like perpetual growth. And it's a source for perpetual growth that comes from within the model rather than from like outside the model. So instead of just going like, well, we just kind of get lucky and then like, boom, we get technology shocks. And then from those technology shocks, we can grow. It tells us a little bit more about how that growth can come from within the model, from our own individual decisions. And we did so by really just making a small tweak on the production function, which was instead of having kt to the power of alpha, it's the power of alpha plus eta. And that alpha plus eta gave us a source for a like balanced growth path rather than just that flat line steady state. Um, and that balanced growth path was really generated by the presence of spillovers in production or externalities as such. Um, so here, what we're going to do is we're just going to expand on it a little bit more. And instead of going like, all right, well, we're going to have this source for like perpetual growth in that production function, the production function is going to be a little different here. And maybe it's actually going to be a little bit more intuitive for you guys. I know that when I was learning this material, this model here actually made a little bit more sense to me at first than the model for perpetual growth that we learned about in the last section. But it's good to have a whole like range of models that we're going to be learning about when it comes to growth and development. So again, really what we're doing is we're just taking the neoclassical growth model and we're tweaking it again. You'll probably learn throughout the course that a lot of what happens is just the neoclassical growth model being tweaked, either in the sense of like, okay, well, we're adding a new variable into the utility function or into the constraint, or for the production function, or the interpretation of it might vary a little bit depending on whether it's like growth or business cycle macro stuff. But overall, right, we've been getting a more realistic and a more like accurate measure of how the world works by improving upon these models. So this is really going to be a discussion of Bob Lucas's 1988 model on human capital accumulation with a couple of tweaks. The biggest one being that it's in discrete time instead of continuous time. Now, you might be going like, well, what the hell's the difference? Be glad that you don't know what the difference is. I took courses that were like almost entirely in continuous time, and I still don't really feel like I have that great of an understanding of continuous time dynamics. But what we're going to be doing here is we're going to add human capital, which is a measure of how much we want to invest in people's education and skill sets. And it doesn't necessarily mean like you have to go to school to get human capital. It could also mean like you're getting something like on the job training or on the job experience that helps you produce more efficiently. So, you don't have to be some college educated, PhD, egghead academic to have human capital. You could be this handyman who also has human capital. And hold on to this guy because we're actually going to be coming back to him a little bit later on in this lecture, as I actually got some pretty interesting stuff to talk about. And it's really fun to be able to use stuff from like entertainment and really like anything that's like culturally relevant when it comes to discussing economics. It makes things a little bit easier. And the nice thing about every now and then being able to do that is it makes macroeconomics a little less abstract, because it can very easily become the case like it's not the easiest thing in the world to have like these nice little applied problems in macroeconomics. It's not like, oh, Bob has an aggregate production function in his pocket and he wants, like, you don't really get that. So it's nice to be able to play with that. Anyways, so maybe we should actually talk about human capital for a minute, because I've really gone on about it ad nauseum thus far in the course, but I haven't really given you guys a good, firm understanding or explicit description of what it actually is. So what is it? Well, it's knowledge, basically. It's like a skill set, or like just a skill even. that would be deemed important and useful in production. So it could be like, being really good at math or computer programming, because a lot of companies need computer programmers until it gets replaced by AI. But it doesn't have to be in the context of producing ideas. It can also be in the context of producing things like the ability to weld until that gets replaced by automation and AI. So it's ultimately just a skill set. It could be really anywhere or anything that is seen as desirable among firms and makes anyone that has these skills more useful and thus more productive. And here's the interesting thing about human capital: it doesn't depreciate. So physical capital depreciates. And we've gone on about this like ad nauseum as well. I've talked about airplanes, as I'm a big aviation nerd, but there's other things that depreciate. It's not just airplanes. It's not just restaurants like capital, like grills or fry stations or whatever, because I also used to work in restaurants. So, it's kind of, you draw from personal experience here. It's other things like, me also drawing from personal experience when it comes to like roller coasters, right? I was in Florida a couple of weeks ago with a friend of mine, and we went to Busch Gardens in Tampa and rode a couple of really awesome roller coasters there. They're great. I'm a huge roller coaster nerd, if you haven't noticed. And one of them, which has always been one of my favorites, is this one here, Montu. It's really cool. It's like the track's like over your head and your feet like dangle underneath. It's like a ski lift almost. It's really cool. It's like a really screwed up ski lift. And I mean, this is considered one of the better, if not one of the best, roller coasters of this like kind, called Montu. And unfortunately, it's pushing like 30 years old, and it's it's starting to fall apart. And you can tell it was starting to fall apart because the park was just running one train operations all day, and it was a Saturday. It was a really busy Saturday too. Um, and probably they're doing that to reduce further wear and tear on the track, which means, well, it's falling apart. It's depreciating. Now, when a roller coaster gets old and falls apart, they can do one of two things. They can either just tear it down and build a new roller coaster that's something entirely different, or in the case of Universal's Islands of Adventure, there's always the Incredible Hulk, which they built in like the mid 90s. They ran it literally every day for like 365 days a year for 20 years, and went, oh my God, this thing's getting old and starting to fall apart. So this is where that replacement of capital that's falling apart comes in. They actually just went in and retracked the entire damn thing. It's an entirely new roller coaster in the exact same layout as what it was before. Now, we can only hope that they do this with Montu, but here's the interesting thing, right? These are both physical capital examples, but human capital doesn't depreciate, it appreciates. What does that mean? Well, it means instead of falling apart and no longer being useful, it continues to be useful, and its usefulness increases over time. Because if you come up with a cool idea, right? Say you come up with the idea of a steel roller coaster. Well, somebody goes, hey, I like that steel roller coaster. I'm going to take that and I'm going to add something to it. I'm going to flip the track upside down and put the cars underneath the track instead of on top of the track. Then your feet can dangle, and it's really cool. It's a neat new ride experience. Or for the Incredible Hulk, I got the steel roller coaster and it goes upside down, and well, you're sitting on top of the track instead of underneath the track. But like, it's got this cool like launch thing at the end of the lift hill. It comes like, launches you out of a tunnel. It's a cool ride experience, something new, right? That's the ideas behind that. That would be human capital. So human capital appreciates over time because you can add new stuff. It doesn't just have to be roller coasters or airplanes. It could also be papers and economics, right? You get the solo growth model, and then the neoclassical growth model, and then you get like a class of endogenous growth models. You get, models with human capital. There's other models too that unfortunately we're not going to be able to talk about. There's models of like directed technical change, all these things, and they're always building off of that stuff. Why? Because human capital appreciates, it doesn't depreciate. So how is this different from what the last thing was? Well, it's got human capital. And how are we going to look at that? Well, we look at that by setting up the model mathematically and then solving it out. So we're going to start with our utility function. It's the same as what we've seen before. Now things are going to change with a constraint here, which starts with production. So output here is a production of both, or is a function of both physical and human capital. So I've got y equals a times k to the alpha times h to the 1 minus alpha. So I want to note here that h is not the same thing as labor. I've belabored the point, no pun intended, here, but human capital isn't labor. It's like knowledge. It's skill sets. It's, it could be schooling. It can be on-the-job training, something like that. But we've got two types of capital. So there's physical capital, which is like the stuff that's used in production. And then we've got human capital, which is like the skills and the ideas used in production. So we're choosing between two types of capital instead of just one. Now, the resource constraint is the same. It's y equals c plus I. So output is still split between consumption and investment, although another difference is in the investment equation. So originally investment was just the flow of capital over time. Here, well, it's capital and physical capital and human capital. And we're choosing both KT plus 1 and HT plus 1. So just like physical capital, human capital is a state variable. So H sub t was chosen today. H sub t plus 1, H sub t was chosen yesterday. H sub t plus 1 is chosen today, but can't really be used, can't do anything with it until tomorrow. Now, another thing that is of note here is we don't have a flow of capital. So it's not like KT plus 1 minus delta KT. We don't have that. So it's really just to make things simpler here. I wanted to get the intuition of the inclusion of human capital and not have to deal with like any more tedious math. Cool. So, all right. More implications coming up next. So as I've said previously, physical capital falls apart, human capital doesn't. So you put an idea into a book, and that book is there forever, I guess, until it gets burned or something. But you build on ideas that already exist. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel every time you want to, come up with a new car. You don't have to prove a derivative every time you use it. That would be a real pain in the ass if you're taking my class. Airbus doesn't have to redevelop the concept of an airplane every time they build a new plane. Why? Because these concepts already exist. We already know they exist, and we've already shown that they work. So you can just take what already works, what's already been developed, and then add to it. So in this model, we don't assume anything other than that you need to buy new capital and invest in more human capital. So there's not anything with like depreciation or appreciation of either capital stock. It's just, are you going to buy more capital this period? Are you going to invest in more human capital this period? Or are you just going to consume more stuff? So we combine all three of our constraints, and this is what we get. And as we've done before, I just want to solve this thing for C sub t and plug that into C in that utility function, get a Bellman equation. So I solve equation 5. I solve that resource constraint to get this right here. So C equals output minus investment. Slight restatement, but not all that different from what we've seen previously. And then I'm going to plug this into the utility function and formulate my Bellman equation from there. So equation 7 here is my Bellman equation. Now note, one thing of interest here, we're choosing two things instead of just one. So with the neoclassical growth model and with the endogenous growth model with perpetual growth, we only chose capital. So it was V of KT. Now here it's V of KT and HT. Why? Because we're choosing not just physical capital, but also human capital. So this value function, this Bellman equation, is a function of two inputs rather than just one. Now, as a result of that, right, an implication of that is when we had neoclassical growth, we only had to worry about capital. Now we've got human capital and physical capital, so we got to take two derivatives instead of just one. And the model says that we want to choose how much physical capital to own, so we want to know how much physical capital we're going to be investing in, but we also want to know how much human capital we're going to be investing in for tomorrow. And there's a couple of ways that you can think about this, and it really depends on the time horizon or the frequency of the data that you're looking at. It could be a dynastic family planning problem. So a family wants to know how much human capital to invest in their children, right? The more they invest in their children, the more their children can go out and earn, which means a nice retirement home for you, but also means a better life for our kids, which is something that we really want. So there's like some altruism sort of implicitly assumed in the model because, well, parents generally want the best for their kids. At least, when I become a parent in May, I'm going to want the best for my kid. I already want the best for my kid. She's not even born yet. But you can also think of it as another way. You can think of it like in terms of investing in human capital for yourself. But again, you don't just go, I want to invest in human capital for myself and then just do it, right? It takes time because, well, you have to apply to schools. You probably have to take some sort of prerequisite exams in order to be able to get into some of the schools. You have to secure funding for the schools. That's always a real blast. And then you have to wait until the next term that you can be accepted into whatever that program is. So, and if it's like a PhD in economics, you can't just go, I want to get a PhD and start getting your PhD today. You generally have to wait until the fall of that upcoming academic year before you can really start going. And that's assuming that you've got all the required prerequisites, namely in math. But also, it's so funny, they require like 1 million math classes and then like 2 economics courses. But anyways, so you can think of it either way. It can either be planning for your kids, or it could be planning for yourself, but just a little bit down the road. So these parents, or you, will just want to invest as much as you can either into your kid's future or your own future by selecting HT+1 to maximize utility. So you want first order conditions for capital and human capital. So the first order condition for capital is this. This really isn't that different than what we've seen previously. Right? Yeah, we've got V of KT and HT, but like if you just drop that HT out, nothing's different. And then we've got the same thing, but for human capital rather than physical capital. So for both of them, you get 1 over CT times -1 plus beta times that partial of V with respect to either physical or human capital in period T+1. So just like with the neoclassical growth model, we need to know what this term, this guy, and this guy is. We need to know what both of these guys are. So what do? Well, same thing as what we did before. So I take derivatives of that Bellman equation again, only with respect to KT and HT rather than KT+1 and HT+1. Update by 1 period and substitute them back in. So the derivative of the value function with respect to KT gives me 1 over CT times the marginal product of physical capital, which is alpha times A times K to the alpha minus 1 times H to the 1 minus alpha. And then I need my marginal product of human capital, which is 1 over C times 1 minus alpha times A times K to the alpha times H to the minus alpha. So again, we're really just doing, it's just partial derivatives with just another variable in there. But recall, with partial derivatives, if you're taking the derivative of a function of K and H with respect to K, well, H is treated as constant. So you just treat H as if it's just a hard number rather than like a variable. And as such, well, you get equations 12 and 13. And updating each of them by 1 period gives us this. So all you do is just add 1 to every T subscript that you find. And, well, now this gives you equations 14 and 15. But the left-hand side of equations 14 and 15 were those terms that we didn't know yet in the Bellman equation in our first order conditions in equations 8 and 9 over here. So now we know what those funky looking derivatives are in equations 8 and 9 because, well, it's equations 14 and 15. So I take equations 14 and 15, plug them in, and that gives me equations 16 and 17. And so it's just 1 over ct times -1 plus beta times 1 over ct plus 1 times the marginal product of physical capital equals 0. And 1 over ct times -1 plus beta times 1 over ct plus 1 times the marginal product of human capital equals 0. That's equation 16 and 17. Now, you probably see where this is going because a lot of what we have in equation 16 and 17 are the same. It's really just what's in the parentheses right after that 1 over ct plus 1 that's different. But if everything else is the same in these, then maybe that implies something about what we have in the parentheses in equation 16 and 17 as well. So, right, this gives me my Euler equations here. So I got 1 over ct equals beta times 1 over ct plus 1 times the marginal product of physical capital, and 1 over ct equals beta times 1 over ct plus 1 times the marginal product of human capital. That's kind of cool. So these are our two Euler equations. And these Euler equations govern how we're going to be choosing to invest in physical and human capital for the next generation, or just for us in the same generation. Again, either way that you want to think about it works for me. I'm more partial to thinking about it in terms of like investment in our kids' future, but as we'll get to some examples later on, it does kind of make sense to also think about it in terms of investing in your own future. So you need both in order to operate production, right? You need the stuff, the things to produce things, and you need the ideas to produce things as well. And they're both vitally important equations in our mix. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do a little bit of algebra. And I'm going to move that beta times 1 over ct plus 1 to each side. So I'm dividing both sides of equations 18 and 19 by that beta times 1 over ct plus 1. So that gives me ct plus 1 over beta. So I get ct plus 1 over beta times ct equals my marginal product of physical capital. Alpha times at plus 1 times kt plus 1 to the alpha minus 1 times ht plus 1 to the 1 minus alpha. But I also get ct plus 1 over beta times ct equals the marginal product of human capital. 1 minus alpha times at plus 1 times kt plus 1 to the alpha times ht plus 1 to the minus alpha. And the left-hand side of equations 20 and 21 are the same, right? It's just ct plus 1 over beta times ct. And it's not, a ct plus 1 over ct for physical capital or ct plus 1 over ct for human capital. They're just the same. It's just ct plus 1 and ct. Now, ct plus 1 and ct are not the same. They can be, but here they're not required to be the same. But the left-hand sides, that ct plus 1 over beta times ct in equation 20 is the same as the left-hand side of the ct plus 1 over beta times ct in equation 21. So I've got equation 20 being equal to something, and I've got that same something being equal to equation 21. So that implies that the right-hand sides of equations 20 and 21 are also equal to each other. So I set the right-hand sides of equations 20 and 21 equal to each other, and that gives me this right here. So I have the marginal product of physical capital equal to the marginal product of human capital. Now, got to do a little bit of algebra. So I've got an ht plus 1 to the minus alpha on one side and ht plus 1 to the 1 minus alpha on the other. So if I divide both sides by ht plus 1 to the minus alpha, well, that gives me this. Well, now I've got ht on the right-hand side. I've got ht plus 1 to the minus alpha over ht plus 1 to the minus alpha. So that just reduces to 1. Left-hand side, I got ht plus 1 to the 1 minus alpha over ht plus 1 to the alpha, which just reduces to ht plus 1 to the power of 1. Cool. That's not too bad. Well, if I did that with ht plus 1, surely I can do the same thing with the kt plus 1, right? So I got an alpha minus 1 and an alpha. So I'm going to do the same thing with kt plus 1 to the alpha, which reduces to alpha times at plus 1 times kt plus 1 to the minus 1 times ht plus 1 equals 1 minus alpha times AT plus 1. Well, I can further reduce that by moving KT plus 1 to the minus 1 to the other side of the equation, which now just gives me KT plus 1. So I've got alpha times AT plus 1 times HT plus 1 equals 1 minus alpha times AT plus 1 times KT plus 1. Cool. Well, now I've got an AT plus 1 on each side. Right, and that's my source of technology. So this is telling me that, like, at the margin, well, maybe the technology shocks in this framework, right, looking at the equivalency between human and physical capital marginal products, maybe that AT term or the AT plus 1 term doesn't have anything to do with it, right? Because this is at the margin making our decision between investing in human or physical capital. So I divide both sides by AT plus 1. And don't know why it says add delta to both sides. Ignore that. You know what? Do better than ignore that. Pretend it never even existed. Ah, the magic of editing. Love it. Love it. All right. So divide both sides by AT plus 1, which just gives me alpha times HT plus 1 equals 1 minus alpha times KT plus 1. And if I divide both sides by 1 minus alpha, I get this. KT plus 1 equals alpha over 1 minus alpha times HT plus 1. That's kind of interesting. Actually, you get some really, really interesting stuff out of this. What do you get? Well, you now have a really nice simplified relationship between capital and human capital. And this is a relationship that's at the margin, remember, because, well, this came from our Euler equations. So this is telling me about really when it would be useful to invest in physical capital or when it would be more beneficial to invest in human capital. And we would know this by that relationship alpha over 1 minus alpha. Now remember, alpha was capital's share of income, in which case 1 minus alpha is human capital's share of income. So it's the ratio of their shares of income that really determine whether we want to invest in physical or human capital. So this really holds for all t, right? Because there's no like t and t plus 1 here. So it can really just come down to KT and HT, which says that at the optimum, right, these marginal products of physical and human capital are equal to each other for every single time period t. So when households optimize, they invest in physical and human capital until the marginal products are equal to one another. So, okay, what does that mean exactly? Well, it means if you want to invest in physical capital, that's great. But if you're going to be choosing optimally, you invest in physical capital up until the point that its marginal return is equal to the investment in human capital. When the marginal returns of both of them are the same, when they're both equal, then you are choosing optimally. So what did the model do here? Well, it took that previous one and it, instead of considering spillovers, it takes human capital and it considers the effect of human capital in an endogenous growth model framework. So we split the capital stock into two forms here. So now you got physical and human capital. So since there's two kinds of capital to choose from, you have a choice of how much you want to invest in learning and how much you want to invest in like the stuff that's required to build things. A great way to understand this is, again, on a generational time frequency where your parents are choosing how much human capital to invest in you, or how much you're choosing, how much human capital you're choosing to invest for your children. And so they're really deciding for you if they want you to go to college or not. And you're deciding for your children whether you want them to go to college or not. And you would be doing this if you expect there to be higher earnings for attending college. Now, this is where things get interesting. Have you heard of a guy named Tucker Carlson? Now, when I initially wrote this chapter in the book. And when I made this initial lecture, this was in, I think, 2018. And he wasn't quite as famous as he is now. So chances are very, very good you've heard of this guy. And it's this guy right here. This is back when he was on Fox News. He has since departed Fox and gone elsewhere. And he said some really stupid things about economics before. Um, I mean, he said that like GDP isn't a good indicator of economic health, which like, what? It's not the only indicator of economic health, but it's a pretty damn good one. He said things like technological growth is bad because it displaces workers. Again, what? Yes, it does displace workers, and that does suck. But there are measurements that exist to tell us whether the technological growth is worth it or not. He's even gone as far as to say that going to school isn't worth it, which I was like totally flabbergasted when I heard that. Um, he and a lot of other people like him are deeply critical of, very deeply critical of the returns to college education. They think it's like a raw deal. Like, well, you're going to college and you're getting all smart, and then you're all dumb and shit. Um, people like him are going to tell you it's a waste of time to go to college because, like, I don't know, the student loan debt crisis, which does suck. Don't get me wrong, that's awful. Um, or there aren't enough new jobs for college educated kids. But here's the thing: the BLS keeps producing studies that say the number of net new jobs are all jobs that require a college degree. Um, BLS showed that all net new jobs in the last decade required a college degree, and most new jobs will even need some sort of like post secondary education. I get high five myself for getting a PhD in economics. Woohoo! Um, but the thing is, like, he's acting like there's this weird conspiracy of like elites trying to force you to go to college so that they can extract wealth from you or something. But at the end of the day, here, college is necessary. Not to mention, this guy even has a degree, I think, from like a really nice private school in like history or something like that. So it's not like he doesn't have a college degree. He's got a college degree, and then he's trying to tell you not to go because it's like worthless or stupid or I don't even know. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Okay. Um, you know what? Let's skip that for a second. Let's move over to this really great movie, like fantastic movie. Uh, it's called Dazed and Confused. It came out in like 1990 or 1991, I think. And it's just kind of like a day in the life of these high school kids. And it's just a really, really good, fun movie. Now, um, there's all these high school kids, and then of course there's like that like 20-something-year-old guy that like hangs out with all the high school kids, and well, he's like really, really into the high school girls. It's kind of creepy. It's like really creepy. Now there's this great scene in the movie with this guy, right? With Matthew McConaughey back when he was like 20 or something. And maybe you know the scene, maybe you don't, but it's that whole like, it's what I like about those high school girls, man. If you can get past those super cringy remarks, and you will get no denial from me that is a really cringy remark. It's a guy in his 20s chasing like high school freshmen. Um, but in that scene, not long after he makes that really gross comment, um, he's asked about whether he wants to go back to school or not. And there's this, yeah, man, I just as soon keep working, though, keep a little change in my pocket. Better than listen to some dipshit doesn't know what the hell he's talking about anyways. No, it's just kind of a throwaway line just to, sort of establish the guy's character. But, we can actually sit down and unpack this for a minute because you can take it like a couple of ways, right? This guy, Wooderson, that's his last name. You can think of it as, he's assuming the returns to human capital investment are less than the returns to physical capital investment, right? He wants a little cash, a little change in his pocket. Maybe that's spending money. It could also just be he wants to keep it in savings and, wants to be able to invest or something. It could be a slightly more correct way, or maybe not. I don't know. That on-the-job training is better than schooling, right? Because not only does he just say he wants to keep a little change in his pocket, he also wants to just keep working. So maybe he sees it as a little bit more important that he keeps working because on-the-job training might be more valuable to him than schooling. So in the first way, what he's assuming is that if we go back to the first order conditions and, the thing where we take the marginal products of physical and human capital and set them equal to each other before we did all the nice reducing and, simplifying math stuff, what he's assuming is that the marginal product of physical capital and the marginal product of human capital are not the same. Thus, the economy wouldn't be in equilibrium because too many people would be getting educated in his mind. Kind of like with what like Tucker Carlson would be arguing here. And that not enough people would be getting, say, physical capital holdings. Okay, it's, one way of looking at it. It's, one interpretation of the implications of the model. But second way, you could think about it maybe in terms of like there being two types of workers. Now, this is something that the model doesn't touch on, but can very easily be extended to discuss. And it's that there are maybe two types of education. There can be schooling and on-the-job training. Now, we've talked a lot about schooling so far and why you would want to go to school and the optimality conditions upon which you would continue to attend school and when you would go, okay, maybe I've got enough school. What about on-the-job training, though? Right? If you opt not to go to school and you want to join the workforce right away, straight out of high school, well, you're going to get really important skills ahead of your cohort when they decided to go to college. So your cohort, think of like, they're building job skills kind of being put on hold for anywhere between 4 and 10 years, depending on how much schooling they want to get and, how quickly they progress through school. So that, gives you a good 4 to 10 years of a head start. You could simply just opt to not go all the way in your schooling. Maybe you want to get a bachelor's degree instead of a master's, or you want to get a master's instead of a PhD. Either way, what you're doing is you're substituting, possibly, abstract, less useful schooling for also possibly more useful skills required by your company. But here's the thing, right? These skills could help you in some way, and they could also help you, falling behind in other ways. The thing is, if you go to and you get like on-the-job training, okay, you will learn a lot of things, but in learning those things, we all face trade-offs in economics. You forego learning other things. Now, the things that you learn could be some skills that directly help you work more efficiently in ways that your company might like. You might know the ins and outs of your company. You might know the way the whole corporate structure works and all that. You could be a very, very efficient worker. But if you didn't go to school, you get those now possibly not all that useless anymore schooling and these abstract ideas that allow you to think outside the box, that bring new ideas into your business. So it's not that like one is more or less useful than the other. Although, if we were to develop or discuss a model, there would obviously be optimality conditions upon which, one would be more or less useful than the other, depending on their respective and relative returns. But if you choose to go to school, okay, great. You get all these cool new ideas. Some of them maybe you get to use, and I'm sure a lot of them you probably would never touch ever again. There's a lot of things I learned in graduate school that I'll never touch ever again. There's a lot of things I learned in grad school that I will play with again, that, I can take with me to my job and then go, hey, I learned X, Y, and Z in grad school, and, this statistical process might be really useful for, a forecasting method or something like that. You can take these ideas in. But the thing is, I don't have the on-the-job training that other people that have been there longer than me that opted not to go to graduate school might have. So there's benefits to each. And, it really comes down to you, and I guess in the context of the model, the optimality conditions for which one is best for you to pursue. Right? So in the case for the on-the-job training, right? So the second case, the first case we already talked about with, how we could maybe interpret Wooderson's statements here. But the second case, you're still investing in HT plus 1. Right. And this is where, maybe it doesn't make sense to think of it in terms of the next generation. It could be your generation. It could just be what you do next year or over the next 5 years. You could still invest in your own human capital. And when this happens, you'd be getting more on the job training if the marginal product of human capital exceeds that of the marginal product of physical capital. which, remember, if the marginal product of physical capital is less than the marginal product of human capital, that would imply that physical capital holdings are greater than human capital holdings because of diminishing marginal returns in the production function. And as such, you would want to increase HT plus 1. You would want to get more schooling or more on the job training. I guess in this case, it'd be more on the job training. So this is where it would come down to like maybe two types of workers. And the model doesn't really address this part, but this is still something that's worth talking about, at least just sort of in passing. There could be workers who produce things and then workers that produce ideas. And this, could lead to the concept of like high and low skilled labor, which could actually be more like what Wooderson's talking about in that scene. He doesn't want to go to school to get high skilled training because he's happy with where he is. And the opportunity cost of putting his earnings on hold is just too high to justify going to college. Now, if that were the case, say, there is high and low skilled labor, right? Think about it on your own, how you'd maybe tweak the model to include that, right? What do you think you would do? How do you think you would want to include that in the model, given the type of framework and the type of setup that you've seen thus far? And maybe think about like abstracting from capital and just assume a production function of like only labor or something like that, and then have two types of labor, say high-skilled and low-skilled labor. Now, when it comes to high-skilled and low-skilled labor, there's lots of people we can listen to and hear them talk about it. And a lot of people we don't want to hear talk about it, but there's no one that we should listen to more than that of our very own Kathleen Kennedy. Listen to Kathleen Kennedy. Now, if you don't know what that is, there's a South Park special that came out last year called Joining the Panderverse. It's totally fantastic. Really, really funny, regardless of where you stand on the political or like social debate of the main story. Now, it's a little bit of a hot button political issue, so I'm just going to conveniently just pass right by that, which is the first thing that happens in the episode, where Eric Cartman is concerned that Kathleen Kennedy is going to try to replace him with like diverse female characters. Well, second one, Randy Marsh wants to call a handyman to fix his oven because like the oven door's broken, and he realizes that, quote, no one knows how to do shit anymore. And this is the subplot that I want to be talking about, because he needs a handyman to come fix his oven. And at the beginning of the episode, he wakes his kids up and he's like, come downstairs, I'm going to show you how to fix the oven because no one knows how to do shit anymore. And then he's like, so here's what we do. We've got this broken oven door. And in order to fix it, you pick up your phone and you call the handyman, and the handyman comes and fixes it. But the handyman comes, takes a look at the oven, and he's like, well, I can't really do anything right now because I got to order a part. And when the part, when I actually get the part, well, it's going to be a while before I can come fix it. It's probably going to be a couple weeks. And, Randy's like, why the hell is it going to take a couple weeks? And he's like, well, I got to do work for this guy and this guy and this guy and this guy. And it turns out he's in such high demand for his services that the prices to have him come over and fix your stuff get bid up to like these ridiculously extreme levels. And all the handymen end up becoming like billionaires in the country. And it leads this whole like debate over like income inequality and, whether those with a college education wasted their time trying to get all this schooling. And it is so funny. So you get these two handymen that get like ridiculously rich. I think one buys Instagram and the other buys like Facebook or Twitter or something like that. It's really, really, really funny. But this goes back to that schooling and on-the-job training stuff that we've been talking about for the last little bit. And here the market is rewarding on-the-job training over schooling because, well, too many people got college education. So think about what the optimality conditions would be in this sense. Do we have an equality or do we have like an inequality? Because, well, here, maybe say not enough people skipped college and got on-the-job training. A lot of people decided to go to school instead. So the returns to the on-the-job training exceed those of schooling. And this is where I think Randy Marsh has like a geology PhD, and he's offering the handyman. He's like, if you can do this for me, I can do some geology for you. And then you get like a newscaster doing the same thing. You get a psychologist, which it turns out his services are being replaced with AI, and there's computer programming. The guy offers to like, I can do coding for you or something. It's really, really, really funny. And there's hilariously some pretty interesting economic implications in terms of like growth and development stuff. Um, but both of these are human capital investments, just different kinds, because there's schooling and then there's like on the job training. So you could really think of it as like two different types of human capital accumulation. And this leads into like the 1967 Ben Porath model or the 2002 model by Daron Acemoglu on directed technological change. These are both really fascinating. Unfortunately, don't have the time to learn about it in the class, especially the 2002 model is like ridiculously advanced. It'd probably take me like a week just to solve it all out and explain what every equation is and all that. And yeah, I'd like to keep it a little bit simpler than that. I don't want to give you guys too much to go on. But outside of like cultural relevance in terms of like entertainment and all that, there's other implications from this as well. There's like cross country differences in income, um, because the world starts at some point t0, and we're going to have initial endowments of physical and human capital, and differences in that initial endowment will persist forever in these models. And it could explain why, even with catching up growth, some countries are still a little bit behind others. And if you think of like, say, HT plus I for all I, as like individual human capital, and then a capital H for like aggregate or total human capital, you can choose to invest in your own human capital wherever you live, right? That is your choice. You get to do that for yourself. But you'd be like more productive in an economy where the aggregate human capital is higher. So could possibly also be the case that this explains like some migration patterns. Why are you seeing movements from one country to another? Now, there's an interesting quote from Robert Lucas, and this is from his 1988 paper that this whole model discussion is really kind of around. And it's I don't see how one can look at figures like these without seeing them representing possibilities. Is there some action a government of India could take that would lead the Indian economy to grow like Indonesia's or Egypt's? If so, what exactly? If not, what is it about the nature of India that makes it so? The consequences for human welfare involved in questions like these are simply staggering. Once one starts to think about them, it's hard to think about anything else. And it's a really fascinating quote. So maybe stew on it for a little bit. It's really interesting stuff. But well, that actually ends the chapter, which then ends the section on growth and development. Now the thing is, we barely scratched the surface on these models. I mean, you could take an entire course sequence on growth models and still just get a fraction of what's out there. And that's actually what I did in graduate school. I took like a sequence of growth courses and like directed research and all that stuff. And even still, I feel like I know next to nothing about growth. But from here, we'll be moving on to business cycle macro, where we're just going to see two models. So instead of like, what, four? You're just going to see really two business cycle models, maybe three if we have time. But it's really just coming from a class of models. It's the real business cycle model and then the new Keynesian model. The real business cycle model is really just sort of an expansion on the neoclassical growth model, but it's solved from a decentralized rather than a centralized approach. And then the class of new Keynesian models came out, which just took the real business cycle model and tweaked it to explain the influence of fiscal and monetary policy. But we'll be learning about that in a little bit, so there's no point in harping too much on it. But essentially, we're transitioning from this long-run low-frequency data to like short to medium-run high-frequency data, or at least higher frequency data. So instead of looking at like annual or decadal data, we're looking at like monthly or quarterly frequency. And as such, we're going to stop looking at what causes growth. So we're done with that. That was this model, or this chapter. This model was the last one. And instead, we're going to start looking at models that discuss the causes of business cycle fluctuations and then what affects business cycle fluctuations. And, well, that will be the remainder of the course. So I hope you're enjoying things so far. Thank you for watching. I know this was kind of a long one. But yeah, this wraps up growth and development, and it wraps up the endogenous growth model with human capital. Thank you for watching, and more to come with business cycles later.